A simple trip to the mall turns into a nightmare for a Vietnam veteran when his wallet and his Purple Heart are stolen in broad daylight. Left heartbroken on the curb, he believes all hope is lost until a delivery driver stops his car and makes a life-changing decision. What starts as an act of kindness soon spirals into something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. Diego, but when the whole city gets involved, will justice be served? Or will the thieves get away with stealing from an American hero? Frank Dawson never liked going to the mall, but life didn't give him much of a choice. His old boots echoed against the tiled floor as he carried a small bag of groceries, weaving through crowds of weekend shoppers. He never cared for the noise, the rush of people brushing past him, or the kids glued to their phones, unaware of the world around them. But today wasn't about comfort. He needed a few things for his fridge, and his granddaughter had convinced him to treat himself for once. So there he was, at the checkout counter, paying for a modest meal and a few essentials, completely unaware that he was being watched. Frank's wallet sat in his back pocket, worn and frayed at the edges. Inside it held a few bills, an old black-and-white photo of his wife, and his most prized possession, his Purple Heart. He never liked to make a fuss about it, but after all these years it was the one reminder of what he had endured. He had carried it with him every day since the war, keeping it close not for recognition, but because it represented something only those who had been through battle could understand. He exited through the automatic doors, stepping into the crowded parking lot. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. As he made his way toward his truck, his body stiffened. Something felt off. A sudden whoosh of air rushed past his side. Before he could react, a rough hand shoved against his back, knocking him off balance. The sound of a revving motorcycle filled his ears. He spun just in time to see two figures on a black sport bike, the passenger ripping his wallet from his pocket in one clean motion. Frank's heart pounded. His Purple Heart was in there. "Hey!" he shouted, reaching for them, but the motorcycle peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement. A few people turned their heads, but nobody moved. The world around him kept going, oblivious to what had just been taken from him. Frank staggered forward, but his legs felt heavy. He wasn't some young soldier anymore. He wasn't even the strong man he had been 20 years ago. He was just an old veteran who had just lost a part of himself. His knees buckled and he sank onto the curb, gripping his chest as a familiar weight settled in. For the first time in decades, he felt completely helpless. Frank sat on the curb, staring at the asphalt, his fingers twitching against his knee. He had been through worse. Far worse. He had faced gunfire, endured sleepless nights in the jungle, watched men he fought beside take their last breaths. And yet, in that moment, as he sat on a crowded city street, people walking past him without a second glance, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Powerless. His hand moved to his pocket out of instinct, but it was empty. The weight of his wallet, the thing he had carried for decades, was gone. The money didn't matter, the Purple Heart did. That medal had survived wars, a fire, and nearly being lost in a flood back in the ADS. And now? Now it was in the hands of some street thief who didn't even know what it meant. His body slumped forward, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't even sure why he was sitting there. Maybe because moving felt pointless. Maybe because he didn't want to go home and stare at the empty space on his shelf where he used to keep that medal at night. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice was steady, concerned, but not pitying. Frank looked up, squinting at the man standing in front of him. A young guy, maybe mid-30s, wearing a brown delivery uniform with a name tag reading Ethan. He had a large, well-worn delivery bag slung over his shoulder and a pair of tired but sharp eyes. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Got my wallet stolen," he muttered. "Had something important in there." Ethan glanced down the street, frowning. "I saw the whole thing. Those guys took off like they've done it before." Frank huffed. "Probably have." He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the feeling of loss creeping into his chest. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, watching Frank for a moment, before he nodded toward the street. "I just finished my route. My car's right there. I can take you home." Frank hesitated. He wasn't the type to accept help from strangers. But there was something in Ethan's voice, something steady and sure, that reminded him of the guys he used to serve with. People who didn't ask too many questions but just did the right thing. Frank sighed, gripping the edge of the curb as he pushed himself up. His legs felt stiffer than usual, but he managed. Ethan stepped back, giving him space, but staying close enough in case he needed it. They walked in silence toward Ethan's car, a beat-up old sedan, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other. The inside was messy but lived in, full of delivery slips, an empty coffee cup, and a few crumpled receipts. Ethan pushed some stuff off the passenger seat. "It ain't much," he said, "but it'll get us there." Frank chuckled dryly as he sat down. "You'd be surprised what I've written in." As Ethan pulled into traffic, Frank stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. He had expected to go home alone tonight, feeling like the world had taken something from him without a second thought. But instead, a stranger had stopped for him. And somehow, that meant something. The old sedan rattled slightly as Ethan turned onto a quieter street, heading toward the residential district where Frank lived. The city's noise faded behind them, replaced by the occasional honk or distant sirens. Frank sat with his hands on his lap, his fingers still twitching slightly, as if they were searching for something that wasn't there anymore. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan didn't push. That was something Frank respected. Too many people filled silence with empty words, with apologies that didn't fix anything. Ethan just drove, eyes on the road, waiting. Finally, Frank exhaled through his nose. "You ever lost something you couldn't replace?" Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, his other tapping lightly against his thigh. "Yeah," he said simply. "My granddad had this old military watch, wore it every day, said it reminded him of his brothers. When he passed, it was supposed to come to me, but somewhere in the move it disappeared." Frank nodded slowly, staring out the window. "I had that Purple Heart for decades," he muttered. "Been through a war, been through 2 marriages, even been through a house fire once. Thought it outlived me." Ethan turned onto a street lined with modest houses. "I don't know much about metals, sir," he admitted, "but if you carried it all these years, it must mean something real important." Frank scoffed. "It ain't about the metal itself, it's what it stands for, what it reminds me of." He shook his head. Not that those thieves would care, probably already trying to pawn it off for a few bucks. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. "That's what pisses me off," he said, a sharpness in his voice now. "They don't even know what they took. They don't care. Just another quick score for them." Frank smirked slightly. "You sound angrier about it than I am." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe, but I got a problem with people who take things from those who actually earned them." What?" They pulled into Frank's driveway. The house was small but well kept, the porch light flickering on as they stopped. Frank stared at his front door for a moment, before sighing. "You need a ride anywhere?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Nah," Ethan said, waving it off. "Just wanted to make sure you got home safe." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Appreciate it, kid." Ethan nodded back, but before Frank could step out, Ethan spoke again. "Look," he said, shifting in his seat. "If you want to try to get that metal back, I'll help." Frank turned back to him, raising an eyebrow. "You don't even know me." Ethan smirked. "Don't have to. I just know right from wrong." For the first time that night, Frank felt a little less alone. He nodded once. "All right, kid. Let's see if we can find a way to fix this." Frank wasn't one to take help easily. He had been self-reliant for decades, ever since he came back from Vietnam and realized the world had kept moving without him. People meant well, but they never really understood. They offered sympathy instead of solutions, empty words instead of action. But something about Ethan was different. The kid didn't just say the right things, he did them. So, the next morning, when Frank found himself staring at the empty spot on his dresser where his wallet used to be, he grabbed his phone, hesitated for a second, then called Ethan. "Yeah?" Ethan answered, his voice groggy. "You said you wanted to help," Frank said. "Still mean that?" There was a pause, followed by the sound of rustling sheets. Then Ethan's voice came back clearer now. "Absolutely. What's the plan?" Frank smirked slightly. The kid was all in. Within an hour, Ethan pulled up in his beat-up sedan, sipping on a gas station coffee. Frank climbed into the passenger seat, still stiff from the night before. "They got cameras at that mall?" Ethan asked, tossing an extra cup of coffee toward Frank. Frank caught it and grunted. "Maybe. Not sure if they even work." "Guess we'll find out." Ethan put the car in gear and pulled out onto the road. The ride was quiet for a bit, the city just waking up around them. The streets were busier now, people rushing to work, kids waiting for school buses. It felt like another normal day, but for Frank, it wasn't. At the mall, they went straight to security. An overweight guard in a wrinkled uniform sat behind a desk, flipping through a magazine. He barely looked up when Frank approached. "Need to check your security cameras," Frank said, his voice even. The guard sighed, setting the magazine down. "And you are? A guy who got robbed in your parking lot last night?" That got the guard's attention. He leaned forward. "You file a police report?" Frank clenched his jaw. "No." Ethan cut in. "Look, we're just asking if you got footage. It could help us track the guys down." The guard scratched his head. I can check, but these cameras, half of them barely work." Frank sighed. "Figures." Still, the guard went into a back room, leaving Frank and Ethan standing there. A few minutes later, he came back shaking his head. "Sorry, guys. The angle's bad, can't see much. Just some blur flying past." Frank exhaled slowly through his nose. Another dead end. Ethan, however, wasn't done. "What about the stores?" he asked. "A lot of them got their own cameras, right?" The guard shrugged. "Maybe. You'd have to ask around." Ethan nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." Frank glanced at him. The kid was relentless. For the first time since this whole thing started, Frank started to think maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at getting his medal back. Frank and Ethan moved through the mall with purpose, stopping at every store that had a camera facing the parking lot. Most of the managers gave them the same answer. "Sorry, we can't share footage unless the police ask for it." Others simply shrugged, uninterested in helping. Frank clenched his fists. He hated this feeling, the feeling of being stuck. He had spent his whole life pushing forward, finding solutions, never waiting for someone else to fix things for him. But here he was, getting shut down at every turn. Ethan, however, wasn't giving up. "We just need one store," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "One good camera. Somebody saw something." They reached a small electronics store near the exit, one of those places that sold phone cases, headphones, and all sorts of random tech gear. The manager, a young woman in her 20s with bright red hair and thick glasses, eyed them warily. "Footage," she repeated. We do have a camera that faces the entrance." "Why?" "My wallet was stolen last night," Frank said plainly. "Had something important in it." The woman frowned. Did you report it?" "No." Frank admitted. Ethan stepped in. "Look, we're just asking to check. We're not trying to cause trouble. The mall security cameras were useless, but yours might have caught something." She hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. "I could get in trouble for this." Ethan sighed. "Lady, please. It's not about money. The guy's a veteran. The thing they stole means a hell of a lot more than a few bucks." That seemed to land. The woman adjusted her glasses and glanced toward the back office. "All right," she said. "I'll give you 5 minutes." Frank exhaled, relieved. Finally, a break. Inside the cramped office, the woman pulled up the footage from the night before. The timestamp showed just after Frank had walked out of the mall. They watched as the motorcycle pulled up near the curb, 2 figures barely visible in the dim light. "You're yon, Lane," Ethan pointed. "Pause it." The woman froze the frame. It was blurry, but they could make out a partial logo on the thief's jacket. Frank leaned in. "That's a gang tag." His voice was low, controlled, but there was a sharpness behind it. Ethan shot him a look. "You recognize it?" Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've seen it before." Ethan grinned. "Then we got him." Frank didn't smile. He knew this was just the beginning. Frank sat in Ethan's car, staring at the frozen image on Ethan's phone. The grainy footage from the electronics store wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The logo on the thief's jacket wasn't random. It belonged to a local street gang known for petty crime, car theft, and running small-time rackets. Frank knew that logo well. Years ago, he had seen it spray-painted across alleyway walls, on cheap leather jackets worn by kids who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. They hadn't just stolen a wallet. They had stolen a piece of Frank's life. Ethan tapped the screen. "You sure about this?" Frank exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I've seen these punks before." Ethan shifted into gear, pulling onto the street. "Then it's time to take this higher up." Frank gave him a sideways look. "What does that mean?" Ethan smirked. "It means we're going to see the mayor." Frank frowned. Politicians weren't his style. He had learned long ago that most of them talked a big game but did little when it really mattered. "What's a mayor gonna do?" Ethan shrugged. "Depends. But Linda Grayson's different. She's been pushing for more security in this city for years. If anyone's gonna listen, it's her." Frank sighed. He wasn't in the mood for bureaucratic nonsense, but at this point, what other options did he have? The mayor's office was modest, nestled in a brick building downtown. The secretary at the front desk eyed them carefully when they walked in. Frank in his worn-out flannel and boots, Ethan in his delivery uniform with coffee stains on the sleeve. "We need to see the mayor," Ethan said. The woman arched an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Frank said flatly. She gave them a tight smile. "And I'm afraid—" A voice from the back interrupted. "Ethan?" They turned to see Mayor Linda Grayson standing in the doorway of her office. Sharp-dressed, mid-40s-esque, no-nonsense attitude, she crossed her arms, looking between them. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said. "What's going on?" Ethan didn't waste time. "Frank here got robbed last night, and the punks who did it, they're part of a gang. We have proof." Grayson's expression darkened. "Come inside." Frank followed Ethan into the office, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Mayor Linda Grayson leaned forward in her chair, her fingers steepled as she listened. Ethan had done most of the talking, laying out everything they knew, from the grainy mall footage to Frank's recognition of the gang's logo. Frank sat beside him, arms crossed, watching the mayor closely. "I've been trying to crack down on these guys for months," Grayson muttered. "Petty thefts, stolen cars, vandalism. Always small enough to avoid major heat, but enough to be a problem." Frank's jaw tightened. "Well, now they've made it personal." The mayor studied him. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" Frank nodded. "Vietnam." Grayson exhaled, tapping her pen against the desk. "I know what that medal means. My father served in Desert Storm. His medals were the one thing he kept safe no matter where he went." She shook her head. "I won't let some street punks get away with this." Ethan leaned forward. "So, what can we do?" Grayson didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. "If we go to the police with just this footage, it won't be enough for an arrest. But if we put pressure on them, if we make this public, they'll have nowhere to hide." Frank frowned. "Public?" She turned back to them. "We go to the media. We tell the people what happened. I guarantee someone in this city knows who these guys are. If they see a veteran was robbed for something as sacred as a Purple Heart, they won't stay silent." Frank was quiet for a moment. He had spent most of his life avoiding the spotlight. He never wanted recognition, never asked for anyone's help. But this wasn't just about him. It was about respect. He gave a small nod. "All right. Let's do it." Grayson smiled. "Good. I'll make some calls." She picked up the phone, and within minutes things were already in motion. Frank glanced at Ethan. "You always stick your neck out for people like this?" Ethan smirked. "Only when they deserve it." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe this kid wasn't so bad after all. As the mayor worked the phones, Frank sat back in his chair. He had started this day with nothing but anger and loss, but now he had a fight worth finishing. Within hours the story had spread like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up first, broadcasting Frank's story across the city. Headlines appeared online. Veteran's Purple Heart stolen in broad daylight. Community demands justice. Social media erupted, with posts calling out the lack of respect for a man who had risked his life for his country. People were angry, and that was exactly what Mayor Grayson wanted. Frank wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had spent most of his life in the background, never asking for recognition. Now, his face was everywhere. Strangers were sharing his story, calling for action, demanding the thieves be found. He sat in his small living room, the glow of the TV reflecting off the framed military photos on his wall. The newscaster was still talking about him, about his medal, about the crime. "This feels weird," he muttered, rubbing his temple. Ethan sat across from him, a smug grin on his face. "Yeah? Well, it's working." He held up his phone. "I've already seen 3 people post about recognizing that gang logo. It's only a matter of time before someone gives up a name." Frank grunted, shifting in his chair. He didn't like waiting. The military had drilled it into him. Act, move, strike first. But now he was stuck here, watching and hoping the city cared enough to fight for him. And then the call came in. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He snatched it up, frowning at the unknown number. "Hello?" A voice crackled through the speaker, low, cautious. "Hey, I saw your post. I know who those guys are." Ethan sat up straighter. "Yeah? You sure?" "Yeah. I live in the same building as one of them. They came home late last night, laughing about some old guy they jacked at the mall." A pause. "I didn't think much of it until I saw the news." "They still got his wallet, man. I saw it." Frank's fists clenched. Ethan's voice was calm, controlled. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Look, I don't want no trouble, all right? But they hang out behind that old auto shop on Grand Street, the one near the railroad tracks. If you go there tonight, you'll probably catch 'em." Ethan nodded. "Got it. Thanks." The call ended. Silence filled the room. Ethan turned to Frank. "Looks like we got our guys." Frank exhaled, standing up slowly. His knees ached, but his resolve was solid. It was time. Ethan smirked. "What's the plan?" Frank's eyes were sharp. "We let the mayor know." And just like that, the chase was on. Frank and Ethan wasted no time. The second the call ended, Ethan fired off a text to Mayor Grayson, giving her the address and details. They had their location. Now they just needed a plan. "He's sending a unit," Ethan muttered, glancing at his phone. "Told us to sit tight." Frank scoffed. "Not happening." Ethan sighed. "I figured you'd say that." Frank grabbed his old jacket from the chair, sliding it over his shoulders with the kind of quiet determination that didn't need words. Ethan had seen that look before, in his grandfather, in veterans who didn't believe in waiting around. "You're sure about this?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. Frank pulled the door open. "I'm not letting some punk sell my life for pocket change." Ethan smirked. "All right, let's go." They drove across town, the sun dipping lower on the horizon, casting the city in hues of orange and red. Grand Street wasn't the kind of place people went unless they had a reason. It was filled with old, run-down warehouses, an abandoned rail yard, and a few businesses that hadn't seen customers in years. Ethan parked a block away from the auto shop, cutting the engine. "All right, we wait here. Cops should—" Frank was already opening his door. Ethan groaned. "Of course." Frank stepped out onto the sidewalk, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. The auto shop was dark except for a single flickering light above the garage door. A few cars were parked in the back, and near a dumpster 3 figures huddled together, laughing. Ethan followed Frank's gaze. "Think that's them?" Frank didn't answer. He just started walking. "Man, you really don't do sit tight, do you?" Ethan muttered, jogging after him. As they got closer, Frank recognized one of the guys immediately. Black leather jacket, the same logo from the footage. The punk was leaning against the wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his laughter echoing in the empty street. Frank's stomach twisted. That kid had no idea what he had stolen. Then he saw a wallet. His wallet. Sitting right there on a crate beside them. His heart pounded. They were still carrying it, still treating it like it was nothing. Ethan tensed beside him. We should wait for the... Too late. Frank was already moving. Frank didn't hesitate. With steady, measured steps, he closed the distance between himself and the group of thieves. Ethan cursed under his breath, but followed, staying close. The three punks were still laughing, still completely oblivious to the fact that their night was about to take a turn they weren't ready for. Frank's eyes locked on his wallet, sitting casually on a crate as if it meant nothing. His purple heart, his years of sacrifice, his blood, his pain, reduced to a trinket in their filthy hands. That was enough. Before the gang members could even react, Frank reached out and snatched his wallet off the crate. The movement was swift and precise, his old training kicking in. The hell! One of the punks, the one with the black leather jacket and gang logo, turned, eyes narrowing. Who the hell are... Frank's fist connected with his gut before he could finish the sentence. The kid folded instantly, gasping for air, staggering backward. Ethan's eyes went wide. Okay, well that escalated fast. The other two thieves jumped up. One of them, a skinny guy with a shaved head, reached for something in his pocket. A knife. Don't, Frank warned, his voice cold as steel. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. The kid hesitated. He saw something in Frank's eyes, something dangerous, something that told him he wasn't dealing with just some old man. Then the wail of police sirens split through the night air. The punks froze. Ethan grinned. Looks like your time's up, fellas. Within seconds, squad cars skidded to a stop around them, red and blue lights painting the streets. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting orders. The thieves didn't even try to run. As the cops moved in, Mayor Grayson stepped out of one of the cars, her face set in stone. She took one look at Frank, then at the gang members, then at Ethan. You two couldn't just wait, could you? She asked, exasperated. Frank adjusted his jacket. Didn't feel like waiting. Ethan chuckled. He doesn't do sit tight. One of the officers approached, holding up the Purple Heart. He handed it back to Frank with a respectful nod. This belong to you, sir? Frank took it, his grip tightening around the metal. It was home. Mayor Grayson sighed, but smirked. You're lucky, Frank. The whole city was watching. And she wasn't wrong. By morning, the story had gone viral. People celebrated Frank's determination, his refusal to be a victim. And Ethan? He became the man who stood beside a veteran when no one else did. A week later, the mayor held a citywide ceremony. People filled the park, clapping, cheering, honoring the man who fought not just in war, but for what was right. Frank stood at the podium, the medal pinned back where it belonged. He looked out at the crowd, then at Ethan, who stood off to the side, smirking. Frank cleared his throat. I never cared much for attention, he said, voice steady. Didn't ask for any of this. He looked down at his Purple Heart, fingers brushing over it. But this ain't about me. It's about respect, about standing up for what's right. The crowd roared with applause. Ethan leaned toward the mayor. So, does this mean Frank gets a key to the city or something? Grayson chuckled. No, but I wouldn't be surprised if he runs for mayor next. Frank shook his head with a smirk. That night, under the glow of the city lights, the people of the town celebrated a veteran's honor and the stranger who refused to walk away. Because in the end, one good man standing up for another was all it took to change everything. And that was worth fighting for. Frank Dawson never wanted recognition. He never sought out the spotlight. But what happened proved that respect isn't given, it's defended. A veteran's sacrifice should never be forgotten, and neither should the kindness of a stranger. Ethan Carter didn't know Frank before that night, but he knew right from wrong, and sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference. The city rallied, justice was served, and Frank's Purple Heart found its way home. But more than that, the story became a testament to the power of community, courage, and doing what's right. Heroes walk among us, some in uniform, some in delivery trucks, and some just ordinary people, refusing to turn away. Because, in the end, it's not just about medals or recognition. It's about honor, respect, and standing up for those who stood for us.